18. The Cheerful Giver. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 1 to 8. For, as touching the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you. For I know the forwardness of your mind, for which I boast of you to them of Macedonia, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal hath provoked very many. Yet have I sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this behalf, that, as I said, ye may be ready. Lest, haply, if they of Macedonia come with me, and find you unprepared, we, that we say not ye, should be ashamed in this same confident boasting. Therefore, I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren, that they would go before unto you, and make up beforehand your bounty, whereof ye had notice before, that the same might be ready, as a matter of bounty, and not as of covetousness. But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly, or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that ye, always having all sufficiency in all things, may abound to every good work. St. Paul, as does all of Scripture, moves our thinking into a world unlike that around us. We are now in those passages of Paul's second letter to the Corinthians that deal with giving. In one sense, these are among the easiest things Paul ever wrote when it comes to understanding them, and yet the most difficult, the most trying. Why? Let us back up a moment and see what the Bible has to say about giving. When the Bible speaks of gifts, it has in mind three things. First, it refers to our tithes to God, a tax. God requires it of every man living. Second, it refers to gifts and offerings, supplemental gifts which are in addition to the tithe and are not a tax. These are above and over the tithe. The gifts, the offerings, are voluntary on the part of the individual. They are not mandatory. God says, "You must pay me my tithes, but the rest, offerings and gifts, are voluntary." Third, it refers to the ministering to the saints, verse 1, gifts to the needs of the saints, relief or welfare, as in this case. All three forms are morally compulsory, but are not required as a condition of church membership. Thus, we have here a very urgent aspect of the law which is not mandatory. As members of one another, we are to alleviate the needs of the saints, not by compulsion, but by grace. Indeed, their zeal in Macedonia provoked many to a like zeal in charity, verses 1 and 2. Paul's boasting in the Macedonians will put them to shame if they fall short of his boasting about them, verses 3 to 7. He has made it clear that the Corinthians are a bountiful people in their charity, verse 5. A religious law is at stake. He which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully, verse 6. Therefore, every man as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. Verse 7. God's law is also a matter of grace. We give, having been given to. God's grace overwhelms us when His grace is at work in us. God's grace overwhelms us when we are commanded by it. Verse 8. All three kinds of giving are required by God, and yet the curious fact is that none of these three gifts are known, really, outside of the Bible. In fact, the gifts, the tithes, the giving in paganism were always mandatory, things prescribed by the state to a particular temple or sanctuary. So that, under paganism, you knew where you stood. You gave so much, you gave more if you wanted, but more was not mandatory. Giving was a kind of payment to the gods for permission to operate. We find this kind of thing in other areas with regard to the state. You could not have a meeting unless it was licensed. Even though it was a meeting of just you and your neighbours to discuss some local things, you had to get a certificate of registration and permission and put it on the wall, or else everyone would be liable for arrest. It is important for us to know that between the world of the Bible and the world of all paganisms, there is a totally different concept. In effect, what you are doing in the pagan religions is buying something. You pay for it, and then you are in the clear. So, the idea of ministering to the needs of the saints is not only strange, but really treasonable, because Rome, like every other civil government, taxed its people. There were taxes to take care of government, taxes to take care of welfare, taxes to take care of any special needs, etc. When I state that, it is all recognizable to us, because that is what we have today. Paganism. The state is God walking on earth. The state tells you what you have to do in order to abide in peace with it. So, you have an ugly situation. The state lays down the law. But when you read in the Bible about the 3 types of giving, nothing is said about anything being mandatory. Oh yes, you should pay God his tax, but God doesn't say, "I give the church the right to punish you if you don't." You are to give your gifts and offerings above and over a tithe, and your charitable gifts above and over a tithe, and the church may feel very strictly that this must be done, but it cannot punish you for not doing it. The minute you recognize that fact, you see at once that there is a world of difference between the life of a truly Christian people and a non-Christian one. In a non-Christian state, you have taxes to take care of every need. So, if you go to have surgery, you are not charged in most cases. The state takes over. In fact, it is an ironic fact that if you just submit to it, they will take care of it as far as they want to go and then punish you if you want more, if you tell them, "You're not doing your job." On the other hand, if you go in, as I have, and say, "Well, I can't afford that," they ask, "Why can't you afford it?" It is amazing to them that there is someone who is trying to pay for something himself. What we have are 2 different worlds of government. According to the Bible, the people take care of themselves, and then they take care of one another. The power of the state is limited. The state cannot tax 50% as it does today, let alone 10% as a church is allowed to do, but not given the power to do. You create, when you have a biblical government, a free society. You create a social order radically different from anything that the world has known outside of the Bible. So, the whole issue of giving and of taxation, as the Bible sees it, is a very different one. As long as Israel was faithful to God, it was very difficult, if not impossible, for the kings or judges to gain undue power. In those parts of the Middle Ages where men were faithful to Scripture, and before they made the tithe compulsory, you had a good social order, and a free one. One economist told me that it was a shock to him to see how ordinary people lived in one godly area that he studied. Well, Paul is trying to teach these Corinthians this new way of life. They are not to sit back and say, "Well, let's let Rome take care of it," or "The Roman Office of Charitable Activities will make a handout in due time." On the contrary, we take over. We meet the need, and that is important. That is what we as Christians try to do. We have all kinds of organizations created to meet human needs in the name of Christ and for His purposes. For example, our financial manager, who is abroad now, and his wife Miriam is with us, is trying to meet charitable needs in Africa and South America and elsewhere through Christian giving, to replace, in one part of the world after another, pagan giving with giving that is godly, to turn the whole thing upside down, to make it a matter of bounty, where we give because we have been given to by God, and we help others that they may help themselves. You can see why Paul takes so much time with this. It is not an old subject with him, except with the Jews in the congregation. Rather, it is a new one. The non-Christians are not familiar with it. Paul commends the non-Jewish Christians in Corinth because they did respond so readily. They saw here another way of life, another way of meeting human needs, without creating a vast bureaucracy. Whenever the federal government seeks to do something, it creates a bureaucracy. I recall talking to one man who came from a particular fair-sized city in Arizona. He was a very fine Christian, very able and earning good pay. He was going to move out of the community. Why? He was the only black in that small city, and an office had been set up in the city to take care of charity to blacks. He was not cooperating, and they were turning his life into a nightmare. That is the difference between the Christian and the non-Christian worlds. Paul, as he speaks to the Corinthians, says, "When I was first there, you gave very generously, and I believe you will again, because it is a matter of bounty with you, not a matter of covetousness. He which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully." Verse 6. God, Paul says, loveth a cheerful giver. Verse 7. Paul is creating a whole new world for these non-Jewish believers. It is a world of charity, of love. For a long time there was confusion about those two words, charity and love, because the world of Rome didn't really recognize the difference or the true meaning of either, and when it did accept the word charity, it took it in a status type of sense. It saw it as something mandatory from God's government, so that, just as Rome required it of you to give as much as they specified, so did God. This is the radical thing about Paul. Paul is carrying on what the Bible from the beginning taught, that we live in a different world, and therefore we behave ourselves differently. The world for us is not a world without God, but a world with God, and we are to recognize that we are called upon by Him to give as He specifies, cheerfully, because we know that this creates a totally different world order. It creates a world that is increasingly Christian and godly and governed by men who are not state bureaucrats, who do not give because they are told to give, but because, as cheerful givers, they're happy to meet these Christian needs. So, Paul is commending the Corinthians and others for their godly giving, but he also takes time to explain to them what it means, how radical a requirement it is by God. We are in process of creating a different world. The government shall be upon his shoulders. Isaiah chapter 9 verse 6, we are told. And how can it be so unless we stop all status activities and replace them with godly ones?